like something fragile. If it helps, he said quietly, I brought records. Elena frowned. What kind of records? Daniel looked toward the factory again. Things I should have shown people a long time ago. The rain intensified. Neither of them moved. A truck rumbled through the yard behind them. For reasons she couldn't explain, Elena suddenly felt as though the day had changed direction, as though some old story she barely remembered had just reopened itself.
An hour later, Daniel sat alone in the employee cafeteria. The room smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaner. The breakfast crowd had mostly cleared out. Only a handful of workers remained. A few recognized him. Most didn't. The older employees stole occasional glances. Whispers traveled between tables. Some memories refused to stay buried. Daniel seemed unaware, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He sat quietly near the window, turning pages inside one of his notebooks. Page after page. Numbers, sketches, measurements, observations, years of handwriting. Elena watched from across the room. The more she looked at him, the less he resembled the man described in company rumors. Rumors had a way of simplifying people. Reality rarely did. A shadow appeared beside her table. It was Frank Holloway, senior machinist, 30 years at the factory. Frank followed her gaze. Then his jaw tightened. That's him, isn't it? Elena nodded. Frank stared through the cafeteria. I thought he was dead. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Frank said something that surprised her. You know, I never believed the story. What story? The one everybody settled on. He continued watching Daniel. People like easy answers. What do you mean? Frank sighed. The accident. His voice lowered. Folks wanted someone to blame. Across the room, Daniel turned another page. Still alone, still silent, as though he could not hear them, or perhaps had heard versions of the conversation many times before. Frank shook his head. Funny thing is. What? He looked at Elena. The smartest mechanic I ever worked with wasn't the kind of man who vanished without a reason. Elena followed his gaze back toward Daniel. For the first time, she wondered if the factory had remembered the wrong story, and if Daniel Mercer had come back to finally tell the right one. The man who shouldn't have come back. The first thing Elena Ruiz noticed was the way the man stood in the rain. Not under the awning, not beside the security office, just standing there beyond the gate, motionless, as if he were trying to remember something the building had forgotten. The morning shift was changing over at Hartwell Components, an aging manufacturing plant on the edge of Millhaven, Ohio. Workers in heavy jackets moved through the drizzle, carrying lunch pails and thermoses. Forklifts beeped somewhere inside the loading yard. Steam drifted from rooftop vents into a sky the color of wet concrete. Nobody paid much attention to the stranger at first. Factories attracted visitors all the time, inspectors, delivery drivers, contractors. But something about him felt different. Elena was halfway across the parking lot when the security guard stepped out of his booth and approached the man. A minute later, the guard turned toward the administration building, toward her. Elena, he called. She adjusted the folder under her arm and walked over. What is it? The guard glanced back at the stranger. He says he used to work here. Elena looked at the man. Gray jacket, weathered boots, face lined by years spent outdoors, late 50s, maybe early 60s. Nothing remarkable, until he spoke. My name's Daniel Mercer. The name landed harder than she expected. For a moment, the sounds of the factory seemed farther away. Daniel Mercer. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade. Most people hadn't. The man watched her carefully, not challenging, not defensive, just waiting. Elena studied him. Then the memory surfaced. An old employee photograph, a younger face, dark hair instead of gray, the same eyes. You worked maintenance, she said slowly. Daniel nodded. Long time ago. 12 years. 12 years since the accident, 12 years since he disappeared. No farewell party. No retirement announcement. No social media account. Nothing. 1 week he was there, the next he wasn't. People talked about it for a while, then less, then hardly at all. Factories had a way of moving forward, whether people were ready or not. What can I help you with? Elena asked. Daniel glanced toward the massive production building. Rainwater ran down the chain-link fence between them. His eyes lingered on the structure, almost affectionately. Is Line 4 still running? The question caught her off guard.
Of all the things he could have asked, not who still worked there, not whether the company had changed ownership, not even if anyone remembered him. Line 4, the oldest production line in the facility, and lately, the biggest headache. Why? She asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The hesitation felt deliberate. I'd just like to see it. Elena folded her arms. Visitors weren't normally allowed near active production equipment, especially strangers connected to one of the most controversial incidents in company history. Yet something about him didn't feel threatening. He looked tired, not physically, a deeper kind. The sort of exhaustion that settled behind a person's eyes. I'll need approval, she said. Daniel nodded. I figured. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook. The edges were softened from years of use. The cover was stained and faded. Elena suddenly felt as though the day had changed direction, as though some old story she barely remembered had just reopened itself. An hour later, Daniel sat alone in the employee cafeteria. The room smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaner. The breakfast crowd had mostly cleared out. Only a handful of workers remained. A few recognized him, most didn't. The older employees stole occasional glances. Whispers traveled between tables. Some memories refused to stay buried. Daniel seemed unaware. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. He sat quietly near the window, turning pages inside one of his notebooks. Page after page, numbers, sketches, measurements, observations, years of handwriting. Elena watched from across the room. The more she looked at him, the less he resembled the man described in company rumors. Rumors had a way of simplifying people. Reality rarely did. A shadow appeared beside her table. It was Frank Holloway, senior machinist, 30 years at the factory. Frank followed her gaze. Then his jaw tightened. That's him, isn't it? Elena nodded. Frank stared through the cafeteria. I thought he was dead. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Frank said something that surprised her. You know, I never believed the story. What story? The one everybody settled on. He continued watching Daniel. People like easy answers. What do you mean? Frank sighed. The accident. His voice lowered. Folks wanted someone to blame. Across the room, Daniel turned another page, still alone, still silent, as though he could not hear them, or perhaps had heard versions of the conversation many times before. Frank shook his head. Funny thing is, what? He looked at Elena. The smartest mechanic I ever worked with wasn't the kind of man who vanished without a reason. Elena followed his gaze back toward Daniel. For the first time, she wondered if the factory had remembered the wrong story, and if Daniel Mercer had come back to finally tell the right one.
Chapter 3. What Remains After the Noise. Snow still covered the edges of the parking lot when Daniel finally told the truth.
Not all at once, not dramatically, the way real truths usually emerge, in pieces. Late the following evening, most of the factory had gone quiet. Production on Line 4 was temporarily suspended while engineers reviewed the latest inspection reports. The usual thunder of machinery had faded into scattered noises echoing through the enormous building. A forklift somewhere in the distance, the clank of a tool dropped onto concrete, the low hum of ventilation fans. Elena found Daniel sitting alone in the old maintenance workshop. The room hadn't changed much over the years. Metal cabinets lined the walls, workbenches carried scars from decades of repairs. A yellowed clock ticked softly above a shelf of manuals. Daniel sat with one of his notebooks open in front of him. The photograph rested beside it. The same photograph Elena had glimpsed the night before. This time he didn't cover it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elena pulled out a chair and sat across from him. The silence between them felt comfortable now. Less like caution, more like trust. After a while, Daniel picked up the photograph. My daughter, Elena nodded. The girl couldn't have been older than 16 in the picture. Bright eyes, crooked smile, wind pushing loose strands of hair across her face. What was her name? Daniel looked at the photo. Emma. The answer came easily. The next words did not. Outside, a gust of wind rattled against the building. Daniel stared at the picture for several seconds. Then, he carefully set it back down. Everybody thought I left because of the accident. Elena waited. They weren't entirely wrong. His fingers traced the edge of the notebook. But they weren't right either. The workshop seemed smaller somehow, as though the years themselves had entered the room. Daniel took a slow breath. 3 months after the accident, Emma was hurt. His voice remained steady, which somehow made it harder to hear. A drunk driver crossed the center line. The sentence hung heavily in the air. No dramatic details, no lengthy description, just the fact itself. Real life often arrived that way, sudden, permanent. Daniel looked toward the workshop window, toward darkness. She survived, a pause, but everything changed. Elena said nothing. She understood that some stories needed space. Daniel continued. There were surgeries. Another pause. Therapy. His eyes drifted back to the photograph. Hospital rooms. The words sounded less like memories and more like places he had lived. Years compressed into a handful of sentences. I kept thinking I'd come back to the factory when things settled down. A faint smile appeared. Not happy, almost ironic. They never did. For 12 years, his life became appointments, treatments, medications, insurance paperwork, long drives, and waiting rooms. The notebooks continued because they were familiar, because documenting machinery felt easier than documenting grief. Whenever he visited old colleagues or passed through town, he quietly checked on the factory. Sometimes from a distance, sometimes through people he still knew. And every time he heard reports about Line 4, the same uneasy feeling returned. The machine was developing symptoms he recognized. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Close enough to keep him awake at night. Eventually, Emma noticed. She told me something before she died. The sentence nearly disappeared into the room. Elena felt her chest tighten. Daniel looked down at the notebook. A man who had spent years carrying things alone. She said. He stopped. Started again. She said I wasn't worried about the machine. His smile returned briefly. This one gentler. She said I was worried about the people standing next to it. For the first time, emotion broke through his composure. Not dramatically, just enough. The way a crack appears in steel after years of pressure. She was right. The workshop fell silent. Only the clock continued ticking. The following weeks transformed the factory. Not quickly, not magically. Through work. Long meetings, inspections, arguments, recalculations, and thousands of pages of records. Daniel's notebooks became essential. Years of observations filled their pages. Not theories, not guesses. Observations. The exact way a vibration changed under certain loads. The unusual wear patterns on specific components. Small irregularities most people overlooked. The kinds of details accumulated by someone who spent decades paying attention. One afternoon, engineers gathered around Line 4, reviewing a revised stress analysis. The answer finally emerged. Not a hidden defect, not sabotage, not some dramatic secret. Something both simpler and more important. A gradual load imbalance created by years of incremental modifications. Each change seemed harmless on its own. Together, they created a problem nobody had fully recognized, except Daniel. The solution wasn't revolutionary. It required redesigning several sections and updating maintenance procedures. Expensive, time-consuming, necessary. Line 4 operated without the mysterious failures that had plagued it. Production stabilized. Workers relaxed. The factory breathed easier. And something unexpected happened. People started talking to Daniel. Not about the accident, not about rumors, about life, the years, their families, the things they'd lost, the things they'd survived. The forgotten worker slowly became something else. Not a legend, not a hero, simply a man people finally understood. Spring arrived gradually. Snow disappeared. Grass returned. Sunlight stretched longer across the factory floor. 3 months later, Hartwell Components opened a new employee training center inside a renovated section of the plant. Workers gathered for the dedication ceremony. Nothing extravagant. Coffee, donuts, folding chairs. The kinds of details common in working-class places. The company president gave a short speech. So did Elena. Daniel sat quietly in the back, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. When the curtain finally came down, a plaque appeared beside the entrance. The room had a name. The Daniel Mercer Technical Learning Center. Applause followed. Daniel lowered his eyes. Embarrassed. Grateful. Still unsure what to do with recognition after so many years without it. Yet the most important moment happened much later. Months later, on an ordinary afternoon, a young maintenance technician named Ryan entered the training center, looking for reference material. The workshop library occupied one corner of the room. Shelves held manuals, schematics, and maintenance records. While searching through a cabinet, Ryan discovered an old notebook, weathered, worn, its pages filled with Daniel's handwriting. Curious, he opened the cover. A single sentence appeared on the first page, written years earlier. Simple, direct, the kind of thing a factory worker might write after spending a lifetime around machines. Ryan read it twice, then a third time. Machines tell the truth. The hard part is listening. Outside the training center window, the factory continued operating. Conveyors moved. Motors hummed. Workers crossed the floor carrying tools and parts. Life moving forward. Ryan sat down and turned the page. Then another. Then another. And somewhere beyond the noise of machinery and production schedules and passing years, Daniel's story found something better than recognition. It found continuity. The notebooks would remain. The lessons would remain. The people would remain. And in the steady hum of the factory he had once left behind, a forgotten worker's legacy quietly continued, one careful listener at a time. Chapter 4. The Sound of Things Continuing. 6 months after the training center opened, Daniel Mercer found himself waking up before sunrise again. Old habits, some routines never completely left a person. The house was quiet. The coffee maker clicked and hissed in the kitchen. Early autumn fog drifted across the fields beyond his property. Daniel stood by the window, holding a mug in both hands. For years, mornings had begun with schedules, doctor appointments, medication reminders, insurance calls, long drives, responsibilities that demanded attention before he could think about anything else. Now the silence felt unfamiliar, not painful, just unfamiliar. He was still learning how to live inside it. The phone rang shortly after 6. Daniel glanced at the screen. A smile appeared before he answered. "Morning, Elena. You busy?" "No." "Good." A pause. Then her voice carried the hint of a laugh. "We've got a problem." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound good." "It's not." Another pause. "3 apprentices are arguing over one of your notebooks." Daniel laughed for the first time that morning. A genuine laugh. The kind that arrived unexpectedly. "That's your emergency?" "It is when that's supposed to be working." He shook his head. "You'll survive. We might." The call ended a few minutes later. Yet after placing the phone down, Daniel remained standing in the kitchen, thinking. 12 years ago, he had left the factory believing his chapter there was finished. Now, somehow, pieces of it were still unfolding. Not because people remembered him, because people were using what he left behind. There was a difference. And it mattered. Hartwell components looked different in autumn. The trees beyond the parking lot had turned shades of gold and rust. Morning sunlight reflected from the factory windows. Fresh paint covered portions of the exterior. Several aging sections of equipment had finally been replaced. The building still showed its age, but now it looked cared for, alive. Inside the training center, Ryan sat with 2 other apprentices around a workbench. The notebook lay open between them. "What do you think he meant by this?" one of them asked. Ryan looked at the page. A sketch of a bearing assembly filled half the paper. Beside it, Daniel had written a single sentence. "If you have to force the explanation, it's probably the wrong one." The apprentices debated possible meanings, technical meanings, mechanical meanings, practical meanings. None of them noticed Elena standing nearby listening. Eventually she walked over. The 3 immediately straightened in their chairs, trying to look productive. She fought back a smile. "You know," she said, "he wasn't really talking about bearings." The apprentices looked confused. What was he talking about? Elena glanced at the notebook, then around the room, at the people learning inside it. People. That answer only confused them more. But she didn't elaborate. Some lessons needed time. A few weeks later, Daniel received an invitation. The town council was holding its annual community dinner. Normally he would have declined. Crowds had never been his thing. Attention even less so. Yet Elena convinced him, partly through persistence, mostly through refusing to take no for an answer. The event took place inside an old recreation hall near downtown. Nothing fancy. Plastic tables. Foldable chairs. Children running between conversations. The sort of gathering where everyone knew someone who knew someone. Daniel arrived late, hoping to avoid notice. The strategy failed almost immediately. People recognized him, not all at once. One conversation at a time. A retired machinist approached first, then a former supervisor. Then someone whose father had worked beside him years earlier. What surprised Daniel wasn't that people remembered. It was what they remembered. Not the accident, not the controversy, not the rumors. Helping repair a furnace during a winter storm. Teaching a young mechanic how to read vibration patterns. Driving an hour after work to help a coworker whose truck had broken down. Tiny moments he barely recalled, moments that had survived anyway. By the end of the evening, an uncomfortable realization settled over him. People rarely remembered themselves the way others remembered them. He had spent years carrying his mistakes. The town remembered his kindness. Neither version was complete, but neither was entirely wrong. That night, after the dinner ended, Daniel walked alone through downtown Millhaven. Most storefronts were closed. Streetlights reflected off damp pavement. The air carried the first real chill of approaching winter. He eventually stopped near a small bridge crossing the river. Water moved quietly beneath it, steady, unhurried. The same river had flowed through town during his childhood, during his factory years, during the years he disappeared, and during the years he returned. It had never stopped moving. Daniel rested his arms against the railing. For a long time he simply stood there, listening, not to machinery this time, to water, to wind, to the distant sounds of a town settling into sleep. His thoughts drifted toward Emma, as they often did. There would always be things he wished he could tell her, stories she never got to hear, moments she never got to see, the training center, the notebooks, the apprentices, the strange way life had brought him back. Yet he could almost hear her response, not in words, in understanding. She would have liked the apprentices. She would have laughed at how seriously they argued. And she would have been pleased that he finally stopped carrying everything alone. A faint smile appeared, the kind that comes when grief and gratitude occupy the same space. Different emotions, same heart. For years, Daniel believed legacy meant being remembered. Standing there above the river, he finally understood something else. Legacy wasn't memory, it was continuation. A lesson repeated, a mistake avoided, a skill passed forward, a person helping another person long after the original moment had disappeared. The river moved steadily beneath him, ahead, always ahead, and for the first time in many years, Daniel no longer felt responsible for carrying the past. He only felt grateful to have been part of it. The town lights reflected across the water. The current carried them downstream. And somewhere behind him, beyond the dark rooftops and quiet streets, the factory continued humming into the night, not because of one man, but because thousands of ordinary people kept showing up, listening, learning, building, continuing.